Today's episode is something different from usual. Today, I'm going to tell you my process for writing an episode of New English Stories book. A process is the way something is done. I'm going to tell you my process for making the podcast and the best way to learn a language in general. Why? Well, I realize that I have thought a lot about the theory behind the podcast, but I have never shared it with you, listeners. Hopefully, this episode will help you better understand how to study languages. If you are a language teacher, it can guide you on how to teach better. Around the time I first started the podcast, I was reading a lot of research about second language acquisition. A second language is a language that you learn after your first language, your native language. So, my first language, for example, is English, and French is my second language. Technically, you can have third, fourth, fifth languages, and so on. But we often use the term second language to talk about all languages learned after your first. Acquisition means acquiring, getting something. In this context, it means learning. Second language acquisition is the study of how we learn languages. You might be thinking, why do you use the word acquisition? Why not just say second language learning? Well, that's because we learn languages in a different way than other things. Usually, when we hear the word learning, we think of reading books, studying, and memorization. Memorize means to make yourself remember something. For example, when my parents were at school, they had to memorize poems so that they could recite them without reading them off the page. But languages are not like that. You can't just memorize all the parts of a language. This is because the skill to acquire a language is innate. When something is innate, it means we have it from birth. We aren't born speaking a language, but everyone is born able to acquire one. So, we know that language acquisition is an innate process. We listen to the language around us, people communicate with us, and so we acquire our first language. How we acquire our first language hasn't really changed much in human history because it works. What doesn't work so well is language teaching, at least for most people. Think of your language classes at school. How many students spoke the language well after years of classes? How many students continued to learn after leaving school? Language teaching is mostly still the same as in Roman times. For thousands of years, we've understood that there is a list of grammar rules that you learn, then you fill in the gaps with vocabulary, and bam, you're speaking a language. Except that doesn't usually happen, does it? Now, some of you might have enjoyed this way of teaching. Some people have brains that understand grammar very well. I'm one of those annoying people myself. But you probably still studied English for years without feeling like you could actually speak it. In the 1970s, a linguist called Stephen Krashen had a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea in science that someone is trying to prove. For example, there is a famous story about Isaac Newton. Apparently, an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, and that inspired him to create a hypothesis. His hypothesis was that things are pulled towards the earth, the ground. This hypothesis became the theory of gravity. Stephen Krashen's hypothesis was this: we learn languages by communicating and understanding messages. He called this the theory of comprehensible input. Comprehensible means easy to understand, and input is information that you put into something. For example, when you press a button on your computer, that is input. It tells the computer to do something. When I speak into the microphone, that is also input. The microphone uses sound as input and records it. Stephen Krashen believed that we acquire language by receiving input, reading and listening that is comprehensible, easy to understand. In other words, we learn language when people speak to us in a way we can understand, when we read books we can understand, when we listen to podcasts we can understand, maybe like this one, and so on. In one of his talks, Stephen Krashen gives an example of an experience that inspired his theory. He was working as the director of English as a second language at a university in New York in the 1970s. Next door to his apartment lived a family who had recently moved from Japan. So, of course, he tried teaching English to one of the children, a 4-year-old girl called Hitomi. How did he do this? He encouraged Hitomi to practice speaking. First, he told her phrases to say, "Do you like that ball?" But she said nothing. Next, he gave her the words to say, "Ball, say ball." She said nothing, so then he broke down the words into individual sounds, B-A-L-U-L ball. Still, she said nothing. He tried making a deal with her, making an agreement with her, saying things like, "I won't give you the ball until you say the word, ball." By now, you can probably guess that this didn't work. Then, 5 months later, Hitomi started to speak. By the end of the year, Hitomi could speak almost as well as the other kids her age in the neighborhood. So, what happened in those 5 months when Hitomi was silent? It seemed like she wasn't learning, but she was. She was listening, understanding things in context, and acquiring language through comprehensible input. Now, you may be thinking, hey, I spend lots of time watching TV shows in English. And it's taken me a lot longer than 5 months to be able to speak well. Think of it this way: in those 5 months that Hitomi was in New York, she was surrounded by English all day, every day. And because she was a child, people would be trying to make things easy for her to understand. For those 5 months of the silent period, Homi wasn't speaking, but she was acquiring, and importantly, she was communicating. When people talked to her in English, she didn't just stand there and do nothing. She told people when she understood and when she didn't. She could answer simple questions the same way we all do as children, by making facial expressions like smiling or looking confused, and using body language. When she was ready, she spoke, and her speaking improved very quickly. Since Krashen published his theory in the 1970s, many other researchers have criticized him. Researchers are scientists who do research, create, and test new hypotheses. In science, researchers often criticize each other, saying that someone else's theory is wrong or that the answer is different. Many researchers in second language acquisition have criticized Krashen's idea of comprehensible input. However, almost all second language acquisition researchers basically agree with Krashen. Often, they call comprehensible input something different, or they consider it part of a wider idea, for example, implicit versus explicit learning. There is a lot of research that supports Krashen's theory. In 2021, two researchers, Karen Lishman and Bill Van Patten, said that comprehensible input is not a hypothesis, it is a fact. I agree. While teaching, I've seen so many students who hate learning languages, find it scary, and have spent years studying vocabulary lists but still feel uncomfortable speaking to a native speaker. On the other hand, when I taught them using comprehensible input like stories, games, conversations, and so on, they started to change. They grew more confident and began to use the language without thinking about it. So, when I started New English Stories book, I used Krashen's theory to guide me. As I said earlier, other researchers have added ideas to Krashen's work, and there is lots of important research on second language acquisition that has happened since the 1970s. However, Krashen's theory is a great introduction to this topic, and I think it is the clearest way to talk about these ideas. If I were teaching this as a class in university, I would talk more about other researchers, but this really is an introduction to the topic. If you are interested and want to learn more, I've put more and more videos on my channel, New English Stories book. Today's episode is quite scientific, so if you are finding it hard to follow, make sure to take lots of breaks. In fact, why not take a break now? Go get a cup of tea, go to the toilet, or get some food. I'll see you in a bit. So, the theory of comprehensible input is made up of 5 hypotheses. I'm going to explain each of the 5 hypotheses, then I'll tell you how they helped me design New English Stories book. The first hypothesis is the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis states people learn language when they understand input that is slightly above their current level. Their level right now. You might remember in a previous episode, Why You Must Read English Already, I talked about reading books where you understand 98% of the words on the page. This is an example of the input hypothesis used practically. We learn best when we understand almost all of the text or audio, but there is a small part that is new. Often, we can figure out what the new thing means because of the context around it. The input hypothesis is often written as I_PL1. This is a mathematical way of understanding it. I_PL means interlanguage, the form of language that the learner has acquired so far, and PL1 is the new information that is being added. If you add too many new elements, for example, you read a book where you only understand 50% of the words on the page, you will get tired and confused quickly, and you won't learn as well. So, it's I_PL1 and not I_PLO20. Many researchers criticized this hypothesis and said that this was unclear, what is I and what is 1. However, All popular theories of second language acquisition since the 1970s have agreed with this idea in general. They disagree about what happens in the brain after the comprehensible input, but they agree that it is necessary. Another important thing to add is that input needs to be comprehensible, but it also needs to be communicative. Remember the example of Hitomi. Put punctuation marks where necessary. Earlier, Hitomi was surrounded by children and adults who wanted to communicate with her. She was not learning English from a teacher who only talked about grammar. For language to be acquired, there needs to be communication in the classroom, and for communication to work, there needs to be a goal. That's why I teach using stories. Creating stories and telling stories has a clear communicative goal. Often, that goal is just having fun. Examples of other communicative goals are learning more about the students in the class, discussing serious issues, or working on a project together. If you're learning by yourself, you might think that reading books and listening to podcasts isn't communication, but it is. I'm communicating a message with my stories, and when you read them, you are thinking about what they mean and whether you like them. That is an important form of communication. The second hypothesis is the acquisition learning hypothesis. I talked earlier about the difference between acquisition and learning. Basically, learning is a conscious process. Conscious means you know when you are doing it, and acquisition is a subconscious process. When something is subconscious, you don't realize it's happening. So learning might be studying grammar rules, and acquisition might be understanding the meaning of the word obol by meeting it in lots of different contexts. The acquisition learning hypothesis states that we only improve our language skills through acquisition. Of course, this is controversial. When something is controversial, many people argue about whether it is true or not. Why is it controversial to say that we only improve our language skills through acquisition? Well, it depends on what you think language is. Is language a list of grammar rules and vocabulary like you see in textbooks? That is the traditional way of understanding language. And if you think language is just a list of rules, then it is better to teach the rules even when you are using comprehensible input as well. But there is plenty of research that shows that language is a lot more abstract than this. When something is abstract, it means that it is not simple and clear. For example, abstract paintings can be very beautiful, but when you look at an abstract painting, it is usually very hard to tell what it is. Is that a person, a field, a cow, or just a bunch of colors? It's too abstract to understand. Researchers such as Bill Van Patten say that the language we have inside our brains is very abstract. It's quite difficult to test abstract knowledge scientifically, but it is possible. I won't get into the details because it's quite complicated, but there are ways to test for subconscious knowledge of a language. And now we can even use machines that look at people's brains while they use language. In my own experience, I can usually tell when a student has mainly used conscious learning instead of subconscious acquisition. In the past, I have had students who learn through an app like Duolingo, which mainly uses conscious learning. Often, they didn't really listen to what I said and understood very little. Then, when they wanted to speak, they looked in the air, said and spent a long time trying to find the right word. It was like their brain had put the words in a box of facts and not in the box of language. The monitor hypothesis is Stephen Krashen's third theory. The concept is that we have a monitor that lets us hear and adjust how we use language. For instance, you use your monitor to proofread the grammar and spelling when you write a document. You use your monitor to check that you are using the correct words when you speak in front of an audience. In essence, the monitor is the internal voice that improves our writing and speech. The monitor hypothesis states that consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, after we've already said or written it. But the original speech and writing come only from our subconsciously acquired language. Think of it this way: maybe you find the present perfect tense really hard in English. I know a lot of learners do. So, you study all the rules, learn how to make the tense, and what situations to use it in. But often, you say something and then only realize afterwards that you should have used the present perfect tense. Or you know when to use the tense but form it incorrectly. These are examples of using your monitor. You won't be able to use the present perfect tense naturally until you read and listen to enough English. Until then, you have only learned, not acquired, the language. Many people find it difficult to understand this concept. In other words, you shouldn't go study the rules if there's one area of grammar that you find particularly challenging. Rather, you ought to continue reading and listening to content that is appropriate for you, the I+1 level. And after that, you'll get it without realizing it. When you learn a language in the classroom, there's a lot of focus on speaking and writing correctly. So, you learn to have your monitor on all the time. For some students, this creates big problems. They find that they can never relax in a conversation. They're always worried about making mistakes, and so they have less energy to understand the person they're speaking to. So, if you can, please switch off your monitor, find people who don't correct your grammar, and who make you feel confident while speaking. Stephen Krashen's fourth hypothesis is the natural order hypothesis. The natural order hypothesis states that all learners acquire certain things in a specific order. Interestingly, the natural order of grammar acquisition is quite different from what people expect. The grammar that we often think is simple is sometimes acquired much later than other grammar points. For example, in English, we add an S to the end of verbs in the third person singular of the present tense. For example, we say, I walk, but he walks. This is quite a strange rule because verbs don't change like this otherwise in English. And research shows that, in first language acquisition and second language acquisition, this grammar point is acquired very late on. However, most teachers of English think this is a simple rule, so they spend lots of time teaching it and correcting students' mistakes at an early level. This wastes time and makes students feel bad for not understanding something simple when actually it's one of the last things native speakers acquire as well. If you think of language as a list of rules, then it makes sense to teach this way. But if you believe that language is abstract, then this doesn't make sense. Since Krashen's original theory, research has shown that this idea is true, and that actually, there is a natural order for many parts of language. This is sometimes called ordered development. The order can change a bit depending on your native language, but it mostly stays the same. Finally, Stephen Krashen's fifth hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. Affective with an A means related to feelings or emotions. A filter is something that you use to keep some things out but take some things in. For example, you might use an air filter to keep some things in the air, like oxygen. Oxygen is very important for us to live, but to take out things like dead skin and pollen, which make the quality of the air worse. The affective filter hypothesis states that when a learner has negative emotions, bad feelings like anxiety, nervousness, or boredom, the negative emotions create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. If you're having fun while learning English and you feel relaxed, you're going to understand a lot more of the language. But if you're bored, hungry, or scared that you'll say something wrong, you'll understand less language. Those negative emotions create a filter that stops the language from coming in. Therefore, it is very important for language classes and language resources to create positive feelings. Correcting students for making mistakes, in my experience, mainly creates negative emotions. And over time, students can build up a strong affective filter. I've had students who are so nervous that as soon as they don't understand one word, they panic. They get anxious, and then they cannot understand anything. So, these are the 5 hypotheses that make up Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. I'll just remind you of what they are, then we'll take a break, and when we come back, I'll explain how I use them to make New English Stories book. The 5 hypotheses are: 1. The input hypothesis. We acquire language best when it is just a bit above our current level or I+1. 2. The acquisition learning hypothesis. Subconsciously acquired language and consciously learned language are separate, and improvement comes only from acquisition. 3. The monitor hypothesis. Consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, and not to actually speak and write. 4. The natural order hypothesis. All learners acquire language in a certain order. 5. The affective filter hypothesis. Negative emotions can create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. That was a lot, huh? Your brain must be hurting now. So, let's take another break. You could even go and sleep for a bit, or come back to this episode another day. Don't worry, I'll still be here. Back in the past when I taught English to groups, the issue always was, how do I make myself comprehensible to all these people? It's the same question I had when I started New English Stories book. I already knew how to make my classes and my podcast fun with stories, of course. This isn't an original idea of mine. There is a language teaching method called TPRS, Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling, which uses storytelling and theater to teach languages. But when you teach in a real-life classroom, there are many ways to make yourself comprehensible. You can draw pictures, make gestures with your hands, and translate individual words. Plus, students can tell you when they don't understand, and then you can explain. Often, students come from similar language backgrounds, so you can use words you know they'll understand. For example, if I'm teaching Spanish students, I know they'll probably understand the word comprehensible, because it's similar to the Spanish word comprensible. These words are called cognates, by the way. Another example of an English-Spanish cognate is nation and nación. However, using images or gestures is not possible with podcasts, and I wanted the podcast to be accessible to listeners worldwide. Therefore, I was opposed to both translation and the cognate method. I tried to explain myself in two main ways. I was able to define words and occasionally even convey meaning through sound. For this reason, I divided the stories into 4 levels: beginner, pre-intermediate, intermediate, and advanced. Fortunately, there is a fantastic resource called English Profile, which tells you what words belong to what language level. They use data from English language exams around the world to decide which words were beginner words, which were intermediate words, and so on. They align the levels with the Common European Framework of Reference, or CFR. You might have heard of the CFR before. It has 6 levels: A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2. The beginner-level episodes of New English Stories book are A2 level, the pre-intermediate episodes are B1, the intermediate episodes are B2, and the advanced stories are C1 level. I decided not to do A1 or C2 because A1 is very hard to teach without using translation, drawing pictures, and so on. And when you're at C2 level, you can usually start using resources that native speakers would use, for example, reading Harry Potter or watching the TV show Friends. Every time I write a new story, I decide what level it's going to be. Then, I use the English Profile vocabulary lists to make sure that all the words in the story are at the same level or from a lower level. I also try to include around 10 new words, which I explain the meaning of at the start of the episode. These are always words from a higher level. So, when I write a beginner-level story, I try to only use A2 and A1 level words. But maybe I want to use the word smile, which is a B1 level word. Then, I will make sure to introduce smile earlier in the episode and explain its meaning. This is following Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis. New English Stories book bases its approach on the acquisition learning hypothesis and restricts its input to only understandable language. I teach words in context and hardly ever discuss grammar on this blog. Since I am powerless to prevent you from using your monitor while you are speaking or writing, the monitor hypothesis has little bearing on my podcast. However, My hope is that you will eventually become more relaxed and use your monitor less as a result of the easily understood stories. In a similar vein, I strive to make the stories as enjoyable as possible to avoid creating an effective filter during your English language learning. Alternatively, if you're already quite anxious when speaking English, my laid-back approach will help. Many listeners have told me that they listen to the podcast before bed or that they tell the stories to their children. This is fantastic. You're having so much fun you've forgotten that you're supposed to be learning. Lastly, I don't care about grammar levels because I adhere to the natural order hypothesis. Rather, I aim to simplify the grammar of the lower-level stories. I accomplish this by referring to things more directly and using shorter sentences. I'll give you an illustration. I could write, George took off his hat and sat down at the table in an advanced story. He was hungry, so it was fortunate that there was a ton of delicious food there. I would say, George took off his hat and sat down at the table in a story for a beginner. The table was piled high with delectable food. George was hungry, so that was fortunate. Observe that I used on the table rather than there and George rather than he. Because this is simpler, it takes our brains less time to comprehend. Your brain processes language more quickly and you become more at ease speaking it as you receive more intelligible input. Because of this, at higher levels, you are able to understand far more complex sentences. Traditional language teaching doesn't understand grammar in this way. Instead, teachers say that there are beginner-level grammar points and advanced grammar points. The passive construction is a grammar point that is usually considered advanced. An example of the passive construction is saying, the office was built, instead of, they built the office. If you believe that language is abstract, then this doesn't make sense. And this idea of grammar levels is terrible for communication and telling stories. For example, some language teachers only teach the present tense for the first year of classes because they think the past tense is more advanced than the present tense. So for a whole year, you can only talk about things happening right now. You can't talk about anything that happened in the past. I don't know about you, but I can't tell stories that way. Sometimes, I need to use advanced grammar in my beginner-level stories. To enjoy a story, you just need to understand what's happening. It's okay if you don't know all the grammar yet, you'll pick it up over time as you see it more often. Let me explain with an example. I'll give you 3 sentences about the same idea, starting with simple grammar and moving to advanced. I've replaced one word with a made-up word, so let's see if you can still understand them. 1. I blonde the cake, and she arrived. 2. I had just blonde the cake when she arrived. 3. She's already here, but don't worry, the cake has been blonde. Do you understand the first sentence better than the third? Maybe a little, but blonde is confusing. Now, if I replace blonde with a real word. 1. I cleaned up the cake, and she arrived. 2. I had just cleaned up the cake when she arrived. 3. She's already here, but don't worry, the cake has been cleaned up. Now it's much easier to understand all three sentences, even though the second and third use more advanced grammar. This shows that learning words is more important than focusing too much on grammar at first. You'll learn grammar naturally over time. This idea comes from Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. It's why I create my podcast the way I do, to help you enjoy stories and learn words naturally. Great job for listening to all this. Now you understand how we learn languages better than most people, even some teachers. If you want to improve your English or learn another language, have fun with it and you'll learn faster. If you're a teacher, I hope this gives you some new ideas. If you're wondering where to find good resources, check out my channel, New English Stories B. There, you'll find videos to help you learn, including one with my top 10 tips for language learning. I regularly upload new episodes of the podcast, and you can even download them if you like. Of course, if you love studying grammar, that's fine too. The most important thing is to enjoy the process and stick with it. If you're curious to learn more, I recommend my previous episode, Why You Must Read English. It talks about how reading helps with language learning and explains the research behind it. You can find it on my channel. I'm also excited about my upcoming episode, How to Teach a Language. I'll share tips for teaching a language to someone, like how I've been teaching Esperanto to my girlfriend. I'll share what worked for us and give practical advice. Thanks for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with more.